Phil, let's get to this lead question, which the three of us have for you, which is what happens to office leases in 2024? Let's get started. What are your thoughts on this?
Sure. Well, I'll give you the short answer, and then I think there's a longer answer. So the short answer is I think what happens in 24 is the same thing that happens in 23.
Mhm.
But to kind of justify that, why don't we go to the first slide and I'll kind of give some background on why that's our point of view at CoStar. So the first thing that I like to sort of point out is that this time really is different. If you look at the three major office recessions of this millennium, on the left in the blue there, you've got the dot-com crash in 2000, 2001. And so what we're displaying here is what we call negative absorption. So absorption is just move ins minus move outs. It's the change in occupancy over a given period of time. And so in the 5 quarters or so that absorption was negative in
Mhm.
the dot-com crash, cumulatively, we lost about 75 odd million square feet of office occupancy.
Wow.
Um, yeah. And then
Whew.
in the Great Recession, which lasted a quarter longer, we didn't lose quite as much. We lost about 50. But then in the 4 years, so it's almost 4 complete years since March of 2020 when the pandemic hit.
Mhm.
So we're 200 million. Um, so it really is different. It's a different in magnitude, and it's also different in character. So the
Mhm.
thing about those first two, the dot-com crash and then the Great Recession, is that absorption, so occupancy, actually started increasing again before all the jobs came back. Job growth became less negative, and already companies started taking on more space. Well, that hasn't happened this time. We're actually back on employment trend, well above the level we were before. 2.5 million office using workers lost their job in 6 weeks in
Mm.
2020. But all those jobs plus some are back. And so if you go to the next slide, I'll show you kind of what that looks like. Um, if you look on the left here, so the blue is if we had started at the end of 2019 and employment had kept growing at the same rate for the last 4 years.
Mhm.
The blue shows where we would expect to be, and the red shows where we actually are on the left side. So we're right where we would have expected to be, about 1.5% a year, 6% above the number of jobs that we had in 2019. On the right is occupancy. So occupancy in the 2010s had been growing about half the rate of employment, which is interesting. It means we were already densifying. We were using less space per worker. So
Mhm.
employment was growing faster than occupancy, but it was still growing. They were growing together. Well, now we've actually cumulatively lost, 2.5% of inventory. And we would have expected to have gained that much. So in square footage terms, we've lost that 200 million, which is, for a frame of reference, a little bigger than the entire office inventory of San Francisco.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
Depending on
Wow.
your assumptions, if you take that plus what we expect that we should have gained, or under air quote normal circumstances, you can more or less double that. So then you're talking about something that looks more like Los Angeles. Um,
Wow.
so this is different in both magnitude and in quality, I think, than what we've seen certainly in the last 20, 25 years. So then to really get into the answer to your question, what's going to happen with leasing? So the next slide shows what has happened over the past 10 years or so. So this is a little complicated because I love me a good line chart, but the blue line here is total leasing volume.
Mhm.
And that's we calculate that in square feet, but I've got that indexed to the end of 2014. And then the red line is the number of lease transactions, and then the yellow line is the average size. So if you follow the blue line first, then what you see is that in 2020, volume plummeted. That makes sense. It recovered in 21, 22, and then in 23, it fell off again. And it ended up kind of, around 12% below that long run average, or about where it was in 24. Um, Interestingly,
Mhm.
the number of lease transactions is actually higher than that long run average. A little lower maybe than 2016 or 17, but above what it was in 2019. And so if if the number of transactions is going up, but the total amount of space lease is going down, what that means is that companies are taking on smaller space commitments. And so that's the yellow line, which is the average size per lease, which is about 20% below what it was in 2014. So that was really consistent. Really, if you go all the way back to like Q4 of 22, we had this consistent pattern of a lot of tenants in the market, but their space requirements were smaller. And so that brought the average size down, which in turn brought volume down. That was consistent all last year. And we expect that to continue for a couple reasons. One is that we're about halfway through the churning of the leases executed before 2020. So we've got, high 40% of those left, about half of which are rolling or set to roll in the next couple years. So we think that, companies are sort of responding to the market conditions as they currently exist. And we think they will continue to do that. And if you go to the next slide, there's a tell, right? And it's like a poker game. The tell is that the tenants have already put twice as much inventory on the sublease market as was there on the end of 2019. So it looks like that has peaked. It actually came down a little toward the end of last year, but we're still at 2x what we were, 200 plus million square feet available for sublease, a lot of which is already vacant. So, this is the canary in the coal mine that a lot of these tenants we think are going to continue doing what tenants did in 23, which is to reduce their space commitments. Now, this isn't going to happen evenly. It hasn't been happening evenly. So if you go forward one more, Dan, the first at the market level, on the horizontal axis, so the further to the right a market is on this chart, then the more exposed they are to the information sector. And the information sector is the government Bureau of Labor Statistics category, where most of the big tech companies, Microsoft and Meta and CoStar, we're all information sector companies. So more exposure to the technology sector means more negative absorption, more occupancy loss. And this is just in the last year. So this is not cumulative, but just so San Francisco last year lost 5% of its inventory and occupancy, which is it's staggering. Yeah, it is really staggering. And you can see that they're an outlier, but the trend is there. And another way that this is not happening evenly is, there really is something to the downtown versus suburban. So if you go one more forward, I'll kind of illustrate that.
Okay.
So back to cumulative occupancy losses now. So downtown CBD, central business districts, have lost about 5% of office occupancy since the beginning of Q2 2020. And then, so we actually split this up three ways. So urban would be other urbanized areas that are not quite downtown. So think about a lot of New Jersey or Brooklyn or something like that. That's, you can't really call it suburban, but it's also not downtown Manhattan. So downtown and urban each are about 25% of inventory. And so the downtown's done worse, followed by urban. And then the other half of office inventory is suburban. So in absolute terms, the occupancy losses in the suburbs have been almost as big as everywhere else. But in relative terms, it's only about 1% of inventory. Only about 1%. I mean, that's catastrophic in any other office downturn. But the suburbs have performed, I guess, less poorly. And then finally, in terms of how this is playing out, and we think will continue to play out, is there's been a lot of ink spilled about this notion of flight to quality. And I think that in the way that we traditionally think of quality, that's actually not true. If you define quality in a somewhat different way, then I think it is true. So the color codes you see here, the blue is what we call at CoStar 1 and 2 star. So this would be kind of like your class C and below level properties. We use a star rating system that's intended to be kind of location agnostic and remove some of those connotations. But and then the red bars are the 3 star, which is like your B minus. And then 4 star, A to B plus, and then 5 stars, like 6 or 7% of inventory at the top. That's your trophy, right? And interestingly, if you look at when buildings were constructed, when they were delivered, so anything that was delivered before 2020, regardless of its quality rating, whether it's a trophy product or whether it's a Class C product, they've all lost occupancy. But if it's been newly constructed, so built since 2020, then they've all gained occupancy. And this is, it's lease up, right? It's tenants moving in upon completion of the building, and that 15%, positive absorption looks pretty good, but that's about half what we would normally have seen. So even in these new spaces, they are getting filled up, but it's taking longer than historically it would have. So if you define quality as new, then sort of regardless of the level of that quality, then new is certainly performing better. But if you define quality as in a more traditional sense of, amenities and location and whatnot, then we haven't really seen what you would traditionally think of as a flight to quality. So there's a lot of nuance in the way this is playing out. But I think the short answer to your opening question is we expect more of the same, with maybe a large number of leases, or a comparable to normal number of leases, but tenants in general taking on less space, committing to less.